Jesus, power, and the limits of coercion. The passage we're about to read takes place at the moment when fear, force, and violence would have felt not only justified, but responsible. Jesus is facing arrest. His followers are outnumbered, and a weapon is already in play. What he does here is often labeled nonviolence, but that word can hide how demanding, disciplined, and costly his response actually is. Matthew 26:51 through 54. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Luke tells us something else. After stopping the violence, Jesus touches the man's ear and heals him. I'm going to turn to Luke 22:51. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. This is not a calm classroom moment. This is chaos, fear, and real danger. And it's precisely here, when violence feels most reasonable, that Jesus draws the line. First, notice Jesus does not lack power. He names it explicitly. He could escalate. He could overwhelm. He could end the threat instantly. His refusal to do so is not weakness, it's restraint. And restraint only matters when power is actually present. Nonviolence in the Gospels isn't the absence of power. It's the refusal to use power in ways that destroy the future you're trying to secure. Jesus understands something practical about coercion. We have to live with the people we threaten, attack, and occupy. Violence doesn't end relationships, it defines relationships. You don't get to extract compliance today and escape the consequences tomorrow. Nations remember. Communities remember. Cities remember. People remember. History is full of moments when force looked decisive, where leaders declared victory and assumed the story was over. But violence can end a phase without resolving the conflict. Jesus refuses the illusion that power gets to decide when something is finished. Coercion also changes people in the wrong direction. Fear does not turn enemies into partners. It produces resentment, humiliation, revenge, and distrust. That's why Jesus doesn't just stop the sword, he heals the wound. He interrupts not only the act of violence, but the trajectory it sets in motion. Force can create compliance, but it cannot create cooperation. Compliance has to be monitored, enforced, repeated. Cooperation is voluntary, stable, and resilient. Jesus is not interested in a peace that only holds as long as the threat remains credible. This is why Jesus says something so blunt. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He's not offering a proverb for personal morality. He's naming a system dynamic. If violence becomes your tool, it can never be set down. Power gained through threat must be maintained through threat. People also don't like being invaded or controlled. This shouldn't be surprising, but it keeps being ignored. People don't experience coercion as benevolence, even when it's justified, even when it's effective in the short term. Force hardens resistance rather than dissolving it, especially when resources, land, or sovereignty are involved. Change imposed from the outside rarely lasts. When pressure lifts, systems snap back or retaliate. Jesus refuses shortcuts because shortcuts undermine durability. He is aiming at a future that doesn't require constant enforcement. That's why threats should be the last tool, not the first. Once coercion enters the picture, better tools, diplomacy, trust building, moral leadership, alliance, become harder to use. Jesus exhausts nonviolent authority before allowing harm, and even then, he repairs when violence breaks. And finally, when threats multiply, fear eventually turns into coordination. Isolated targets become coalitions. Escalation invites resistance. Jesus understands this dynamic before anyone writes a political theory about it. If you're listening closely, you already know how this applies today at this moment in American history, internationally and domestically. Jesus doesn't need to name names. He's clear enough. Jesus is not offering a sentimental ethic. He is diagnosing how power actually works in the real world. His rejection of violence is not naïve idealism or spiritualized passivity. It is a strategic judgment about what produces lasting peace and cooperation versus what merely forces short-term compliance. You don't have to argue that coercion is always evil to take Jesus seriously. You only have to admit that he explicitly rejects coercion as a foundation for peace, and that history keeps confirming why. Coercion can win moments. Coercion cannot sustain peace. Jesus chooses the harder path because it is the only path that lasts.